Kuri rā tātou, ki o tātou nei tātou tērā tātou taura.
Just a short prayer to commence our hood. Kia ora tata. Kia inu e tātou, let us pray e te atua e tō mātou matu e te rangi. Nei mātou e tiku atu nei ngā whakamoe miti, whakapetau ki a koe e tia ki e manaki nei a mātou a Aotearoa whānei. Uhia mātou ki tō wairu tapu, whakatauhia tō wairu tapu ki roto e tēnei o mātou whare tuku nei tūnei. O mai kia mātou tō māramatanga, te haere pai e ngā kōrero i tēnei ata e wāngani a mātou. Chekina mai mātou i roto ngā mātou kōrero rero, whiti, whakaaro i tēnei ata, e te atua tēnei tā mātou ingo e te ki a koe, i te mei te ngō te matua, te tama, me te wairu o tapu. Amen.
Mōre nā tātou, tuatahi ka tuku mihi ki a koe rā tuku pāpa i whakatū nei tēnei o tō tātou nei uhuina, mōre rā kanu rā ngā mihi ki a koe. Huri ake rā ki a tātou katoa katoa nei tēnei ata, tēnā koutou. Good morning everybody, just want to welcome everybody to the Waiari Kaitiaki Advisory Group for Wednesday the 30th of April 2022. For those of you that haven't if you can, just keep your mobiles on silent or off. Okay, I think we're all here. I don't think we've got any apologies for today. Okay, so moving through in terms of late items, we have received a late report and just like a mover to receive that report. And a seconder. All those in favour? Aye. Thank you. And then moving through to next item, confidential business. There is none. Change in order of business. We're not changing anything in terms of order today. And minutes. Moving to the minutes from the last week. Are there any corrections to the minutes from those that were present? Can I have a mover and a seconder to those minutes? Gary and Darlene. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. Okay, declarations of conflict. Any declarations to declare? Right. Okay, we'll move to the order of business for today, and we do have a number of reports being presented, and we start with the Waiari Water Supply Scheme project update. I do understand Richard Conning is unwell, so turn to Kelvin. Kia ora, Kelvin. Thank you.
Unfortunately Richard puts his apologies in today. I'm happy to take the report as read, but I'm here to answer any questions in relation to that report.
Any queries, comments, questions in terms of the report? I just had one, and that was in relation to the cultural recognition frames for the delivery of a whether it was a plan or
that together. They're in the throes of doing that at the moment. It's been a difficult couple of months, I think, for everybody, including COVID, so trying to get various people together has been...
One particular thing was mentioned about the bait that was used. Obviously not something that we as Māori would use as a bait, and I think we could get a more accurate picture of the life in the Waiari if we employ some of these things as well.
Yeah, just one, there's a comment here, construction of the intake and pump station is expected to complete by July 2022. I just wonder, seeing we're so far advanced into the project, whether we can get a regular report on scope and time, we're still on time and still within scope to complete it, so that we all know what some of this cultural stuff is. It will be completed by that date. So I think further to yours, Chad, are we actually doing the stuff that's expected so that we hit that date?
That's it. That's a fair comment.
Maru?
I'm just wondering if the report is comprehensive enough, because the attachments to the Waiari, that's the life force of the Waiari, which that was part of our appeal to the environmental court, the Mauri of the Waiari, the life force of the Waiari, which means that the life force of the Waiari has to take into account the birds, the bees, the trees, and that big crowd that's going to be populated in Papamoa and the rest of the place. Part of the networks to the life force of the Waiari would be the regional parks, for instance. If you have a look at the regional streams, rivers, flood veins that links into the Waiari, they have to be protected. Springs are linked to the life force of the river. So therefore, is this report comprehensive? I would say no, it isn't.
Thank you, Maru. Any other? Can I have a mover to the report, a mover and a seconder to receive the report? All those in favour?
Aye.
Against? Okay, moving to the next report, 9.2, water planning update. Claudia.
First of all, I would like to introduce myself. It's the first time I'm talking to this group. So my name is Claudia Helberg, and I'm leading the City Waters planning team at Tauranga City Council. As you can hear from my accent, I'm originally from where two big rivers coming together and flowing into the North Sea. So it's a very flat area, a lot of peat. Some of the land is actually under the main sea level. So it's a very wet area, so I'm really grown up with water all around me. So that's where my passion for water is coming as well. Yeah, so in my report, I'm talking about 2 key projects which were identified as part of the infrastructure, 30-year infrastructure strategy. Tauranga City to understand the connection between freshwater, the environment, and our infrastructure activities, and had some key actions identified. And 2 key projects are now underway, and I'm talking about these ones. The one is the development of the freshwater management tool. And this is another tool for us, which we have got models for flooding, we have got models for our network, how we distribute water, but this is really understanding our normal stream flows and the connection between groundwater and surface water. And so this project was agreed by Council to initiate it through the last long-term plan. And in the meantime, we commissioned consultants to help us with the development of this tool. And we are now in the data collection space. So we are collecting. We work with the regional council. And so there are different steps to develop this tool. So the first is the data collection and building up a model where we take the flow and the rainfall from the last 15 years through this model to see if we can actually mimic what happened in the last 15 years and calibrate the model. And here, just sticking to the Tauranga City Council area, but we are very aware that we need to see what's happening in the upper catchment to really look at the connection from the mountains to the sea. And we also included the Waiari catchment as well. And the groundwater extent of the model is even beyond these areas, but we are capturing everything that is feeding into as far areas as well through the springs. And we anticipate to build up this model by the end of this calendar year. And then next calendar year, we would climate change scenarios. We can look at different potential land use patterns if we think that could make a difference to the water quality, and also different management opportunities. So that would be in the rural areas, for example, more riparian planting, and we can show what difference that would make, for example, to sediment coming into the streams. And also in the urban area, if we have got rain gardens, additional wetlands, how they would actually contribute to cleaning up the water before it goes into our harbors, into the harbor as well. So it's really helping us to understand what is happening, what different interventions or improvements would actually make of a difference, so we can also decide then do something. So it really should help this whole understanding. And we are also very keen, as we are just starting this project, to have engagement with of the Tanga Whenua on how we can make sure the model is then able to replicate for cultural outcomes. And so just one example I'm aware of, sometimes there's a value to have a certain stream flow and you still want to see your toe. So if you have got these type of information for different reaches of the stream into the model, that there need to be a certain clarity of the water measured in scientific terms, which we then can see in the model. So it's very early stage, and we are seeking really feedback on it, how we can actually make sure we set this model up and then do the scenarios which are meaningful for all of the different partners.
I think you're on the right track. Every river has mountains, so that idea of mountains to the sea is a good one. But have you considered looking at the economic capital and social capital of the river. The economic capital will probably make some input into farmers changing their habits in terms of riparians, looking after drains and all that, cutting out pathogens and all those sort of things that are trickling to the river. So there's a riparian plan. The other issue too is secondary use water. Is there any plans for secondary use water in your scheme of things?
Yes. And we are working with the regional council to also align it with their thinking. National policy for freshwater management. We want to link up that type of thinking as well. But these are all the different questions we need to understand, which are important to make sure we can replicate that, yes.
Because I feel that there's economic for farmers, there's economic opportunities for farmers if they handle the riparians right.
Yep.
Like take for instance, if you had the right economics versus and if you had the right developments along the riparian areas, it could be types of horticulture like that could occur along the edges of the riparian or the drains.
Yeah.
Those types of thinking.
Yeah. So this tool is not an economic tool. Decisions as well when you talk about monetary terms, but it's mainly about reflecting all kind of different values which are associated with water, and it's probably something we need to work through how we can actually inform the setup of the tool.
Thanks, Chair. First of all, just a clarification, either to you, Claudia, or to Nick. In terms of this work, I take it it's part of the overall work being undertaken by the three councils in respect of water, because I think we had a report towards the end of last year about this, Nick. So it was just clarification that this is an aspect of that wider work.
You're right, yes. So they are intrinsically linked together, so that they will inform each other. And I just wanted to make part of this corridor as well, that the next part that Claudia is going to talk about, which is that sort of system view, that stems from a meeting with Joel in the CE's office about I can't recall the date now, but where we talked about the pressure the system is under. We see it declining. What can we do about that? And we discussed the concern of just looking at source water in isolation, and between us we sort of thought we need to look at it system-wide. We need to look at it. What is it that replenishes our aquifers, and how does that happen? Do we understand the total? How does that then influence stormwater and wastewater as well? So the two are very much connected. So that they that we're moving on these simultaneously, and also that we have this partnership between the councils to understand the sort of basis for the supply and demand, and also working with the Tau Māori in terms of its influence on the more the demand side, I guess, than the supply side, because the supply side is what it is. But from a systems perspective, we need to understand what is it that replenishes it, and how can we treat it as a precious resource. So definitely connected, Bill.
And just a follow-up, given what you've outlined, and then more specifically, are not specific requirements in terms of the Waiari consent, but are initiatives on that wider basis. So I just really wanted to be clear on that, because I think that's quite important to have that clarity, and then where the responsibilities ultimately lie.
Yeah. No, so it's definitely wider than that, because what feeds the Waiari is also feeding other streams, and so what the supply is, what the aquifer looks like, how that is connected, but then also understand not only the plants that we have in the stream, essentially same aquifer, so that we understand that from a systems perspective, how it fits together.
No, thank you. Gary.
Mine's a bit further on. And it follows from the reason I raised this at our last. I'm not too sure we're handling it properly. This is the first real look at this under the National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management. And when you're looking at a mountains to the sea, and that's where I think it's way outside the scope of this group, but this group needs to understand it. But also, I think it's a question to the Regional Council and to looking at it from a National Policy Statement for Freshwater, which is a catchment look at the world, and is you have to give effect to Te Mana o Te Wai. Now, to give effect to Te Mana o Te Wai, have you identified all of the affected hapu from the catchment, from its beginnings to the end, and make sure that you've got that all covered? Because when you're looking at a catchment like this is the first time I understand in our district, or in the Bay of Plenty, we've taken under the MPS such a big look at the waterway, and to give effect to Te Mana o Te Wai, I'm not too sure we've done that yet. And at the beginning of the project, you've got to go through some of that stuff to make sure that you've got the right people around the table. If you haven't done it, it makes it very difficult going. How we've looked at that.
Just take that on board, and as a point, excuse the pun, but this is very early in the piece, so we can take that away as something to make sure that we do cover iwi and hatu that needs to be involved in that conversation.
So we are currently going out presenting what we're actually doing to raise the profile that this piece of work is basically now underway. And so one of the key next steps is to identify how can we actually engage with Tangawhino on this as a partner, and what is the representation, because there, as you pointed out, quite a lot of iwis, hapus across this area, and how can we make closely actually different partners want to work with us on this.
Through you, Mr. Chair, Nick, are you able to answer whether the catchment management plan is part of this freshwater management tool, or whether the conservation water strategy, that's all part of the two pieces of work sit within this management tool and Te Mana o Te Wai?
Yes, so this is a future look, and of course the consent we need to adhere to. So this is, I guess, you might be able to explain a bit, Claudia, but this is forward-looking in terms of Waiari and what we're working on now. Of course, we have the consent conditions and those agreements in place that we need to comply with and adhere to. And that includes Te Mana o Te Wai as well.
I
think Peter might be able to respond as well.
Yeah, just to add to that, the water conservation strategy is part of our consent requirements, so that gets updated every 3 years. Last time it was updated is 2019, so it's due for an update this year, towards the end of this year. It is on our radar to do that. There's no requirement in terms of a catchment management plan per se. There's no requirement from either a consent condition or any other requirement. However, we as TCC have put an integrated catchment management plan together for our existing 2 water takes. Operationally, it just makes sense how we operate within that environment. We have updated the existing catchment management plan to bring the Waiari into that document. It's currently in draft form and will be finalised later in the year. I can make that available, but with the understanding that it's a draft document, and it's very much an operational document that we use as for informing how we do business within the catchment.
Sorry, Ruben, and I'll come back to Carla.
Thank you.
Sorry.
I just wanted to respond in terms of the Regional Council's responsibility about Te Mana o Te Wai and the NPSFM. And apologies from Ruben Gardner, who was going to come and speak to the group today about that very process. He's at home with COVID at the moment, so couldn't make it, but hopefully we'll be able to get him to a future meeting. So the Regional Council does have an engagement strategy for the NPSFM called Te Hononga, and are engaging, or seeking to engage at the very least, with all iwi and hapu, and that's hundreds of groups across the Bay of Plenty. Essentially what that document does is says here's a range of engagement options, and that's the conversation that the Regional Council is having with each iwi and hapu at the moment about how and when they would like to be involved. And it looks like next year is really going to be the very busy year for that engagement, to understand those values that Maru articulates so well, so that we can address Te Mana o Te Wai and that hierarchy of obligations in a plain in the middle of 2024.
Thank you. I think probably Carla's got a comment on engagement as well.
Yeah, I just thought a great question, and it's those obligations, and then also balance that with each individual authority's obligations and how they would do that. But I guess as a reassurance to that process, some of this information is actually being put in front of the rangapu tomorrow, and we will take that steer from mana whenua as to how they would like to do that. So at this stage it is really early, and that next stage is to actually speak to them and talk to that. What we do know and expect is that rangapu have already expressed to the commissioners at TCC that one of the key principles in all of these waters discussions is that we protect that relationship of kaitiaki to their own taonga. And so within say good information to collect, but we should be and that their relationships up through that catchment will exist, and that we would follow that pathway to then connect.
Joel.
I'll refer to the page 27 of the report under the background heading. The second bullet point says, in Western Bay, it's been identified that water's been over-allocated. I had a conversation with Peter Barrs some time ago. No. We know it's over-consented. I don't understand how that can happen, giving away water that doesn't exist. It's obviously not, there's no advantage there for our Waiari. We've got declining rates of flow, which has been happening since August, which is 7 months now. It's been steadily declining. I see some major issues here. And I go back again to it's been over allocated. How can that happen? There's got to be some mechanism from one of the councils that ensures that that doesn't happen. I'm hoping someone can address that.
Perhaps I can talk to that when I present my paper.
Yeah, we do have a paper from regional council talking about allocation of surface and subsurface bodies. So we might defer that, Joel, till we get to that part of the discussion in that paper. But John's got a question.
Oh, well, there's a comment in regard to that comment, that, if I could, that I am familiar with one stream, not at some distance from here, I will admit, but within the Western Bay of Plenty, that is deemed to be over-allocated. Very short is based upon more recent measurements of the water flow suggest that the water flow is not as great as was originally thought, and that is how it has come to be over-allocated, and work is going on to address that situation and bring it into line. Obviously will take some time to work through.
I think we'll brings that part of the conversation forward. Okay, any other thoughts or comments on this report? I think
which is about the integration of three waters management and working more closely together with Western Bay and Regional Council. And it's in a very early stage, but we actually, a group was formed specifically on the water allocation aspect over the short to medium term time frame. And the terms of reference has been drafted for that. So that group is now basically up and running. And we are having further discussions at the moment more on officers level between Western Bay District Council and TCC on seeing how we can actually expand on that as well, bringing wastewater and stormwater. For now, they are all interlinked with each other, and to not just take a silo view on one water, but actually broaden our horizon and think more holistically. And we also know that TCC's and Western Bay's area are so connected. And so it's really trying to in an integrated all waters. We are working on it, and we recognize that we actually need to step up in that space.
How would you separate secondary water from drinking water? What mechanisms have you got to do that?
Secondary use, so that's like the amount of water. The first is for
Water could be water that you could use for crop.
I think there needs to be a big discussions being held, for example, but if you have got very treated wastewater, and it's really treated well, could that then actually be discharged to land to feed some of our agricultural land? Or not, but I see as a big piece of work if we reuse of what is called grey water, like from your taps. Can you actually use that to water? Taking a lot of water for your use in your house and gardening, and for gardening, and then having, that has got benefits on both sides. You would use less water, and less water would actually be. So that's all these aspects which are not very acceptable, or there are a lot of issues around it, if it's actually acceptable grey water we use from a health perspective. But I think we are coming to a point where we need to explore these options as well, if that's coming our way.
I think the answer to your question, Mara, is read the recent court decision on the Clutha water take. To supply the town of Clutha, but when you identify only 40% is used for the township and 60% is used for other secondary uses, and so the courts are deciding that has to be sorted out. It's a very different world looking forward, and I think the general consensus of the group that I've sit on, I'll cover this later, is forget about what's happened, over allocation, draw a land. What is what is, but it's going to be a very different way going forward.
Bill, happy to move receipt of the report, Chair.
Friday. Thinking about the role of NPSFM over quality, and then we're talking about allocation. I kind of wonder whether we need I'm a visual person, some kind of map that actually maps out how all of these things interact and intersect. We're talking about the 30-year infrastructure strategy. We've got a consent. I mean, it's quite focused in terms of this particular catchment, but we need to be mindful of everything else that's going on, reforms. While we're focused on this, there's all these other influences that intersect, and I think it would be useful for us to, whether we can do that on a page, I'm not sure. Staff might be able to find a good way to demonstrate that. Yeah. But I think it just kind of, just so we can kind of see things and how it all fits together. Because sometimes I think, the whole system's really complex. On this particular take, but actually there's all these other influences that intersect. Gary.
Shall I hear the question? Could I just say, please be patient and wait. Where there's some significant reforms and some of it's in the public arena, that is a national issue and has been recognised and I know DIA are working on it at the moment. It's called a wiring diagram on how it all fits together, and it is complex, but they're hoping to get that out because it's one of the recommendations from the group that June of this year, sorry.
Okay. So that hopefully might be ready for the next meeting.
Yes.
And in addition, I also started just looking at our own pieces of work, how they all fit together. So I probably at the same time could present that as well, which reflects more what TCC is doing, as we have got a lot of different projects which are all somehow interlinked with each other as well.
Any other comments? I've got a mover and a seconder to receive the report. All those in favour? Say aye. Aye. Thank you. Thanks, Claudia.
Excuse me, I've just got to take an urgent call.
Okay, moving to the third report, which is from the Waiari Regional Council, so I'll hand it over to Ruben.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chair, and good morning, everybody. With your leave, I'm quite happy to take the report as read and answer any questions, but I'll try and address Joelle's question first. I think if we look at the Waiari catchment, the huge majority of those consents in place in councils existing, and I think, if I understand those days correctly, there was a view, right or wrong, that water was a plentiful resource, and consents were issued ground and out of streams to do, horticultural, agricultural things, without a very good understanding of the pressures that those consents would put on water bodies, whether those be surface water bodies or groundwater aquifers. I'd agree. I think Mayor Weber said the focus for the Regional Council is now on how do we fix that. So in the GNS work in the late 2000s, there's no more groundwater available for allocation because the groundwater from this area is needed to maintain groundwater pressure and surface water bodies lower down. In relation to surface water, when we went through this consent process, the stream was not fully allocated at that stage, and there was a lot of science and debate around how much water was appropriate to allocate. We ended up with this consent, and that meant that the stream became fully allocated, and so there's no more allocation available. So I think you'll see in that report that no new consents have been granted for a long, long time in this area, and it would be very, very difficult for anybody to get a consent to take water, particularly with the Te Mana o Te Wai obligations that we have to look after the health of the water bodies first. It would seem very difficult in my mind to say when it seems clear that that would have adverse effects on the mana of the Wai.
Any questions for Ruben? Oh, I'm sorry, Joe, does that answer your question?
Yeah. Are you saying if consents are considered in the future, the timeframes would be short?
I think what is likely to happen is that the new plan that we end up with through the National Policy Statement for Freshwater will be much more specific about how we make. My expectation, and this is really just a guess, this has got a long complicated process to go through, is that we'll end up and I think the other part of that is, what I can't put in these reports is the number of people that come to the Regional Council and say, hey, I'm wanting to set up an orchard or farm or take water for something in this area, and we have conversations saying our advice would be not to go through that process. So certainly the duration of consents is up for discussion. So current practice, and this is under the Regional Policy Statement, is to grant consents for either 10 or 15 years depending on allocation status, and could be explicit about expectations, and that could be different for catchments or for rohe, however the community decides that it wants.
John.
And your second line there, for an individual's reason, how detailed are you going to, because we know of domestic water supply, what the average usage on a daily basis for a household is. So to get the domestic, are you thinking of linking the domestic volumes back to the average New Zealand volume, which when it comes to renewal might see it, and then when you look at stock drinking needs, there's enough information from MPI and that sort of thing on the average usage for sheep and that sort of thing, so that we actually get them a bit more targeted than we have done in the past?
Yeah, so we don't issue consents for those takes, is the first thing. So the Resource Management Act says people can take that water without a consent.
Absolutely, yes.
And so most of the time the Regional Council is not going to know that people are taking that water. We did propose in Plan Change 9 a mechanism for registration and in some cases metering of those takes, and we put that you're talking about, Mayor Weber, about what we considered a reasonable use in a domestic and a stock drinking scenario. Do I answer that?
It's a resource that people, New Zealand and the world, are starting to realise you know, those words now, I think resource consent, taking water needs to be managed far better. And I made a submission on Plan Change 9, and I don't know that we've gone quite far enough. But the MPS on freshwater management is becoming an overarching document, which might require us to actually get in line a little quicker.
Yeah, so there's two things there in my mind. The MPS, the original plan can't introduce a requirement to obtain consent for domestic and stock water. So probably the RM reform, the Resource Management Act reform that's happening at the moment is the opportunity to address that issue. And yeah, I think that's a sensible thing to do. Sorry, one more thing. That section 14.3b of the Act does say that people can. So we may end up in some scenarios through the MPS discussion where we say that any takes of water will have adverse effects, and therefore that right is extinguished. But that hasn't happened anywhere around New Zealand, as far as I know, but it is a possibility.
John, and then Maru.
Yes,
Models of multi-descent, let alone are they from Tapuika? We struggle with that.
Ke kone. Can some provision be made for us to be able so that you have a very clear picture as to where Tapuika is standing? That's the purpose of you coming here. Currently, we are an observer status, and which means you could have held your hui in the office, and you take away the value of coming out to the whānau hapuaniwi. So I ask Mr. Chair that you make some provision for tangata whenua, for Tapuika, to contribute to your hui, because it's being done in that light.
Take that they want to raise with the committee. So we do make that available. In terms of the way we've structured the committee is that we were keen to come out to the marae, and we heard from particularly our reps around the table that we need to be here so the whānau can hear the kōrero and hear the discussion. Otherwise we'll be in tauranga, away from, separated essentially from connecting here, but also with the hui between council and to participate, but also to hear and observe the kōrero that's been discussed. Also, you do have a number of reps sitting around the table, and if you have particular take, it would be useful for you to relay some of those things back to them as well. Hopefully they're coming to your monthly marae hui or your marae meetings and reporting on take that's happening around the table. Kei te pai tēnei?
Okay. I don't to the Waiari.
Just in terms of a number of points you've raised, I would suggest Regional Council are also going through their plan making process, which will look at things like allocation and the quality of water. And in terms of this consent, we have to fit within that framework. And so at the moment they're reviewing or going through a plan making process in terms of the regional plan, which sets the criteria, sets the framework in which how water's managed. I would suggest, and Ruben's also noted that they are going through that process of identifying iwi and hapu that will participate and engage in those processes. I would strongly suggest getting involved in those processes as well.
That doesn't give the opportunity to get involved in the policy development.
Well, that's
when you're dealing with whānau and hapu, it's only in broad kōrero basis, and there's no significant opportunity which the Manotoai requires.
So that's at the policy end. We're at the implementation end, which is really around the consent on the ground. So the policy end is in that plan making process to be able to influence the kōrero that Joel's been talking about. Do we have a clear understanding of policy end? That's what the Regional Council is stepping through at the moment. So tapuika, but actually all of our whānau across the region, tapuika, but actually all of
Governor couldn't be here to talk about that policy process today, but I will get an update from him about tapuika involvement. I'm not sure whether you've been involved in that, or Joel, or Helen, or who's doing that, but
one is hesitant because it is such a complex issue. One is really hesitant and to get to the level of involvement. Now you've made the rules so complex, whereas they should not necessarily be complex at all, but you've made them complex. And so therefore one is hesitant to get involved because of the level of input that is required. And with respect to the Waiari, which is a stream, it's not a river, and you must remember that because that relates to allocation and sustainability. The Kaitiaki group is specific to looking after the maintenance of the resource consent conditions. That's really what it's there for. And so the broader issues, for example, Te Arawa believes that the Waiari, we have 50% interest in the Waiari stream. We own the water in the Waiari stream. According to the Te Arawa kaupapa, while water is in the Te Arawa rohe, that is Te Arawa water. Now, what steps are you taking to address that issue, which is above the Kaitiaki group's mandate? But Tapuika is concerned about it, and we are concerned to see that Waiari, Tapuika Te Arawa water is going to Te Rangamona, for example, another district council area. That is a basic issue that must be addressed in this water allocation, getting away from your ordinary rules that you're changing and adjusting. But the Three Waters is intended to address issues such as that, and it implies ownership. It implies 50% ownership because of those governing groups that are to be comprised 50% Māori. So there is an underlying acknowledgement that Māori's rights and interests in water is a serious issue. And we intend to take the government to task on what are our rights and interests in the Waiari water. And we take that as 50%. Just between me and you and the doorpost in the meeting house. We'll go to the press later. But that is the underlying principle. And the Three Waters reforms, that's for the council to have got water. Western Bay is rich in water. From the rivers, from the lakes, Te Arawa is rich in water. And water is the new gold, of course. Now, trying to review plans and review things, we're sick of that. We're sick of that. You say about the over-allocation of these rivers for years. You've had that knowledge. I've seen the reports of the over-allocation of Waiari, or the over-allocation of Kaituma. You've known that for years, so you're not, and now you're saying, well, you're going to review the rules of allocation, so that all of a sudden it's not unallocated. That's the impression that I'm getting. We're sick of it, and we want to make sure. Excuse me for taking the time, Mr. Chair. Because our members can't convey weaker standing. They can't convey to you. I've had mine.
So, yeah, I would strongly suggest getting involved, but also the regional council coming in and having that cordial directly with Tapuika. I think Darlene's just got a comment to make.
Yeah, I do have a comment to make, and it's around preparation online prior to our meetings, which would allow tangata whenua to influence their desires in the public forum. Because then, you know, at some stage, we all need to take common feedback into these meetings. And yeah, that's just my comment and observation.
Kia ora, Gary.
Quite happy to move proceed to the... That was for information for this group. That's all, and so it's outside. Aware of.
Do I have a second to that? So, Bill, any further discussion?
I understand the catchment across the region. Saying that, from a Māori perspective, all of these waterways are about why we need to know what's happening around us. Like we've requested the next meeting, we could have some information of more broader waterways and flow rates and that sort of thing. Yeah.
I just wonder. I take Joel's point about trying to understand the influence in terms of this catchment. The way I understand catchments to work is that it's all water flowing into particular rivers and streams that end up in. And so I'm just wanting, you know, in terms of going wider, otherwise we're potentially getting into other people's areas, into other people's...
What's been mentioned about the Tautau and Wairohi streams, the Mano Rewa Paraiti flow rates declining as well. So that's what I'm getting at. If we can see what's happening around us in terms of trying to figure out some trends or what's going on, we might be able to deal with what's happening with the Waiari better.
But if I can comment. At our last meeting when we raised this recommendation to Tauranga City and to Western Bay and the Regional Council, and that's where the project's been put in place to actually do that work. Look at the whole catchment within Western Bay and Tauranga City, so the region. So maybe we didn't articulate that all that well. That was taken on board, and it's because as you say, it's a lot bigger. Waiari people need to be aware of the Waiari. So whether somebody wants to comment on how long that's going to take. At least a year, because they've got to look at the river flows, all of the streams from the mountain to the sea, all of that sort of thing. What are the allocations across, and what are the usages and all of that, so that level, so it was taken.
Chair, looking at Kelvin, I think it's probably a couple of years for that work to be.
But it's going. Where do we go? So that project has been done.
You need an